In his book, The Body, A Guide for Occupants, Bill Bryson takes readers on a head-to-toe tour of the marvel that is the human anatomy. Starting from the outside and moving in, Bryson begins by describing the largest organ of the human body, the skin. His description is telling. The skin consists of an inner layer called the dermis and an outer epidermis. The outermost surface of the epidermis is made up entirely of dead cells. It is an interesting thought that all that makes you lovely is deceased. Where body meets air, we are all cadavers. He then concludes, these outer skin cells are replaced every month. We shed skin copiously, almost carelessly. Some 25,000 flakes a minute, over 1 million pieces every hour. Run a finger along a dusty shelf, and you are in large part clearing a path through fragments of your former self. Silently and remorselessly, we turn to dust. What a reminder that we all must die. This is one universal truth that every one of us has to confront. However, the fact that we die is not what is most important. What is important is how we face death. Socrates had the last hours of his life recorded by Plato, his famous student. Socrates had been sentenced to death by the rulers of Athens. He was convicted of corrupting the city's youth by his atheism. You see, he denied the literal reality of the Greek gods. And for this, he was sentenced to drink the fatal poison hemlock. His friends, the youth, were gathered around him, and some were weeping, but not Socrates. No. He used the occasion to reason with his young students about death's significance. He did not shrink from it. When the poison at last was presented, quite readily and cheerfully, he drank the poison down and died. What gave Socrates power to die in this fashion? It was his commitment to reason. He reasoned that the soul was part of the spiritual or immaterial world, and therefore good and permanent, while the body was part of the material and evil world, and therefore perishable. Death is only a way an individual can be set free from bodily existence, which is evil, the Greeks believed. So death is the soul's friend, he reasoned. Death frees the soul from a body that keeps it from functioning on the highest level. The problem is that if the person dying can do it calmly on the basis of philosophical hope, death still is a loss for the survivors. Plato confessed that when his mentor drank the hemlock, he, along with the others, burst into tears at having lost such a just and wise companion. But is this the best we could do? Would it be good for everyone to accept death with philosophical stoicism as Socrates did? No. For the believer, there is a better option. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 55 through 57, reads this way. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God, who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. This is what we see in Joseph's reaction to the death of his father, Jacob. We see Joseph accepting death and grieving over it, but at the same time, we also see a death-transcending hope that culminates eventually in the resurrection faith of mature Christianity. Today, I am going to talk about the death of Jacob, where we discover many things to guide our approach to our own death and the death of a loved one. And then I want to talk about the stages of grief. Should we grieve? How? And how do we help someone we know who is grieving? So let's get started in our passage for today, where we left off last week. Genesis chapter 49, verses 29 through 32. Then he commanded them and said to them, I am to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave that is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, in the cave that is in the field of Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, in the land of Canaan, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. There they buried Abraham and Sarah his wife. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah his wife. And there I buried Leah. The field and the cave that is in it were bought from the Hittites. Notice the way that Jacob described the place of burial. I think Jacob was giving legal credentials for his ownership of this cemetery plot. He wanted to do business honorably. But the most important aspect about the place of this sepulcher was that it was in Canaan, the promised land. Let me explain. First of all, Jacob believed he was to be gathered to his people. Now, there is a distinction between being gathered to his people and being buried with his fathers. Jacob used both phrases in verse 29, making a clear distinction. I am to be gathered to my people. Therefore, that's understood, bury me with my fathers. So, get this. Jacob believed that his people, Abraham and Isaac, were still living in the presence of God, living eternally. He believed that there was to be a gathering of himself to them, that he was to join them in eternity. Therefore, he wanted his sons to do something for him. He wanted them to bury him with the great family of faith, Abraham and Isaac. The place where Jacob wanted to be buried, this tomb in Hebron, had become a monument to the faith of Abraham and to Isaac, and now to Jacob, about God's sure word of promise. The miraculous birth of Isaac left Abraham in no doubt that his children would possess the land. He was as sure of the land as he was sure that Isaac had been born. And that is why, when Sarah died, he purchased a family tomb in the very heart of the promised land. Abraham was so sure that his descendants would one day possess the land that he wanted his beloved wife's body entombed in Hebron, the center of the land, as his public profession of faith in God's promise. And Jacob believed that the land would be his descendants with an intensity equal to that of Abraham. That is why he made Joseph twice promise to bury him there. But strangely, Jacob mentions his wife Leah at the end of verse 31. Wait a minute. Wasn't Rachel the wife that he actually loved? And wasn't Rachel just on his mind earlier? Yes. When speaking about blessing Joseph's two sons, he reminisced about Rachel's untimely death. Now, if a modern storyteller were inventing the final scene of Jacob's life, he would have Jacob asked to be buried by Rachel on the road to Ephrath near Bethlehem, not by Leah in the gloomy cave at Machpelah. This would be touching and romantic. But Jacob does not do this. Why? It's because, now get this, although he was greatly attached to Rachel and undoubtedly still loved her, he wanted to be buried in the cave of his fathers as a testimony to the fact that his faith was the same as theirs and that he would live in eternity with them. He wants to be buried where he will be raised from the dead at the resurrection. So he will be right there when God fulfills his promise to the nation Israel. And now, verse 33. When Jacob finished commanding his sons, he drew up his feet into the bed and breathed his last and was gathered to his people. He pulls his feet up into the bed, puts down the staff, and lies down to die. This is Jacob. He has walked a long way through life. He ends in a final act of faith, looking forward to the day when he will be raised from the dead in the land, according to the promise of God. He left behind the wonderful testimony of what a great God can do with an imperfect man who finally sought to live by faith. Now, as we move into the final chapter of Genesis, we find a description for how the sons of Jacob carried out the instructions of their father. Joseph takes the lead, and Jacob goes out in a blaze of glory. Genesis chapter 50 now, verse 1. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. This is the 6th time we see Joseph weeping, and it wasn't a quiet affair. He fell upon his father as he had done Benjamin and his brothers at the family reunion in Genesis chapter 45. The people in our Bible aren't ashamed to express their emotions openly, are they? Joseph didn't let this important office of his smother his true feelings of grief. And then later, we will see in verse 10, Joseph led the people in a week of public mourning for Jacob. Yes, grief is a normal part of life. And Paul writes in 1 Thessalonians 4:13 that believers don't grieve as those who have no hope. However, death is still an enemy. And when it slinks in and robs us of someone we love, we feel the pain for a long time. Death is an enemy, and it can be a fierce one. It is ugly. It destroys relationships. It is to be feared. It is repulsive. There is something odious about death. Never pretend otherwise. But death does not have the last word. 1 Corinthians 15:55 through 57. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting? The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law. But thanks be to God, who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Now look with me, please, Genesis chapter 50, verses 2 and 3. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for it, for that is how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. Joseph took charge, and his command was seemingly very Egyptian. The Egyptians were preoccupied with death, so much so that students of ancient Egypt have termed it a culture of the dead. Egyptian religion, under the influence of the cult of Osiris, required that the body be preserved so that the deceased could enjoy the afterlife. So every body in Egypt was treated with care. However, such superstitions did not inspire Joseph's actions here. We are not to think that Joseph was motivated by any of these unworthy concerns. First, notice that it is emphasized that the physicians embalmed Jacob. not the official embalmers who were professional mortuary priests. This was probably to avoid the pagan religious rituals. Second, Jacob's mummification was actually pretty down to earth. Embalming would make it easier to journey to the land of Canaan with a dead body. Now, verses 4 and 5. And when the days of weeping for him were past, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, If now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, My father made me swear, saying, I am about to die. In my tomb that I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan, there shall you bury me. Now, therefore, let me please go up and bury my father. Then I will return. Even though Joseph was on the best of terms with Pharaoh, he did not go directly to Pharaoh. He sent a royal official. This was probably because he was in an unshaven, disheveled state from his mourning. Verses 6 through 11. And Pharaoh answered, Go up and bury your father, as he made you swear. So Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went up all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. When they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with a very great and grievous lamentation. And he made a mourning for his father 7 days. When the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, This is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians. Therefore the place was named Abel Mizraim. It is beyond the Jordan. What followed was a grand state funeral, conducted with national pomp and ceremony. Jacob was honored by an immense entourage that accompanied his body to Canaan. The procession was made up of 3 groups. First, the elite of Egypt. They were all there. The rich and the famous. As one author put it, the glitterati of the Nile in their finery with their train of servants. Second came Jacob's family. Verse 8 says that it was all the household of Joseph, his brothers and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. The small children of the Israelites, along with their flocks and herds, were left behind in Egypt, which assured Pharaoh that Joseph would return as he promised. Third came the military. Charioteers were unusual in Egyptian funeral processions, but were in this case necessary for security reasons, because Jacob's burial would take place far beyond the borders of Egypt. Jacob was buried with full military honors, as though he had been the commander-in-chief of Egypt's armed forces, instead of a nomadic shepherd who had wandered into the land late in life. The entourage which followed Joseph to Canaan to mourn for Jacob at his burial was a very great company, verse 9 says. It had to number in the hundreds. The spectacle had such grandeur. We can sense that there is something going on that is far more than meets the eye. Why does the writer of Genesis make so much of Jacob's funeral, especially in light of the fact that there was no such treatment for Abraham and Isaac? Why does Egypt's glitterati make this event so important, even traveling all the way to Canaan? Think about it. Egypt is the most powerful nation in the world, and God has them mourning the passing of his great patriarch. God is demonstrating how he is in control of the nations. To Israel, God is stating a message through Jacob's grand funeral. He says, I brought Egypt to mourn for your father Jacob and to royally honor him. I will bring all nations royally to honor you as long as you are obedient to me. Throughout our study of Genesis, there have been so many opportunities for us to gaze in wonder at God's strategic control of history. And right now, this is a good time to ask ourselves if these reminders have had the needed effect on us. Do we find the comfort that such truth should provide? Do we rush too quickly to fear each worldly crisis and panic with the rest of the world? Or do we look at the world and ask for God's insight on how we might communicate our trust in him? Verses 12 through 14. Thus his sons did for him as he had commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field at Machpelah, to the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with the field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. As Joseph and his brothers left Hebron and crossed the Jordan to join the procession back to Egypt, they took their last look at the promised land. None of them would see it again. Can we think that this entire trip failed to have a strong and beneficial impact on the Egyptians? What about this burial in the ancestral tomb of Abraham, Isaac, and the others? Are we to think that Joseph was silent during these several weeks concerning the importance of Abraham's tomb and the promises God made to his people? Certainly not. Joseph took charge and used the event, I am sure, to testify to God's salvation promises. So must we. Those of us who believe in Jesus Christ. We grieve, but not like the rest of men who have no hope. 1 Thessalonians 4:13. We believe that Jesus rose, and that because he rose, those who have died in faith in him will also live again. Death is defeated. The grave is robbed of spoil. Okay, I believe that it is necessary for me to transition from here to some very important considerations about death and dying. I mentioned earlier that I would be discussing with you the stages of grief, and that is what I would like to do now. This will be based largely on James Montgomery Boyce's writings. First, there is the shock of death itself. Often, as in the case of an accident, if the shock is sudden, intense, and shattering, nothing so characterizes this stage as a turmoil of conflicting emotions, like having an egg beater thrust into the mixing bowl of our emotional life, as one writer put it. There may be fear. What's going to happen to me now? There may be anger. Wives sometimes have been angry at their husbands for leaving them. There may be guilt. Many feel that the death is their fault, or that it would have been less painful if they had shown more love, had more time, or displayed more understanding. Usually, there is just bewilderment. Where am I? What has just happened? What should I do now? These feelings will pass. The emotions will settle down. But this takes time. And other people have a role to play in the transition. Statements of fact should be made. It's time to go home now. You need to eat or sleep. Friends can encourage the shocked survivor to cry or begin to express his or her thoughts in words as much as possible. I have recommended that they write letters to their loved one, telling them about their day and how much they miss them, and to do this in a dedicated notebook for that purpose. Second, there is numbness. Nothing seems quite real, and the person who is grieving withdraws. C.S. Lewis's reactions were like that when his wife died. He wrote, "There is a sort of invisible blanket between the world and me. I find it hard to take in what anyone says, or perhaps hard to want to take it in. It is so uninteresting. Yet I want others to be about me. I dread the moments when the house is empty. If only they would talk to one another and not me." In this stage, the person is aware of what is happening, but is detached from it. The numbness is like that of a wound healing. Third, there is renewed activity. Eventually, there is an attempt to get back into things. This is what Joseph was doing in his return to Egypt. In this stage, the threads of life are again picked up, and the work that has been interrupted goes on. Fourth, the last stage is adaptation. It is evident at this point that life will not be the same as it was formerly, but there is an acceptance of this and a recognition that there is still good experience ahead. This last stage may be delayed. Some never reach it, but most people, particularly Christians, come through the grief process and find life enriched with the close presence of God and the joy of serving Him again. But the question is how? How does one who has lost a person dear to him or her get on with living? How do you help someone who you know is going through the grieving process? Well, knowing the stages of grief that I just mentioned may help. But please know that grief is a path that each person treads alone and at their own pace. Trying to help them is like trying to help a teenager through their roller coaster of emotions. But perhaps Elisabeth Elliot can point us in the right direction. Elisabeth Elliot had suffered the loss of 2 husbands. The first, Jim Elliot, was killed by Auca Indians in Ecuador while trying to reach them with the gospel. The second, Addison Leach, was slowly consumed by cancer. What helped Elisabeth Elliot through her grief process? We don't have time to cover all of her advice, but let me point out a few pieces. Number 1, be still and know that God is God. Her response to death or some other tragedy comes from Psalm 46, in which the writer pictures the earth being destroyed. Waters are roaring and mountains are all shaking while swirling into the heart of the sea. This is not a bad description of the way one feels in the first shock of a loved one's death, she notes. Everything that seems most dependable simply is no more. In such a time, it is a profound comfort to know that although all things seem to be shaken, one thing is not. God is not shaken. God is our refuge and strength and ever-present help in trouble. That's verse 1 of Psalm 46. Therefore, it makes sense to be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. Verse 10. Stillness is something the bereaved may feel they have entirely too much of. But if they will use that stillness to take a long look at Christ, to listen attentively to his voice, they will get their bearings. Number 2, give thanks. There is much we cannot be thankful for, or at least cannot see how to be thankful for. Death itself and the resulting loneliness, for example. But we can be thankful for the promise of God's presence through the valley. Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and staff, they comfort me. Psalm 23:4. We can be thankful that in the face of life's terrors, God is still in charge. Refuse self-pity. Number 3. Self-pity is one of the most destructive, paralyzing forces of life. It is, says Eliot, a death that has no resurrection, a sinkhole from which no rescuing hand can drag you because you have chosen to sink. Self-pity must and can be resisted. When some great sorrow enters our lives, we want to think that it is a greater burden than we should ever be called upon to bear. That it's a greater sorrow than anyone has ever borne. But that's not true. Death, suffering, and sorrow are the common lot of humankind. Giving ourselves over to that line of thought, we argue that we do not deserve such suffering. But what are we saying when we voice an opinion like that? That we deserve better? That we deserve anything? We deserve nothing. And if we suffer, we can know this, that the Lord Jesus Christ endured suffering in a far more intense manner before us. We were not called to escape life's sorrows, but to suffer as he did, following in his steps. Then one of the last pieces of advice Elizabeth gives is this. Number 4, do something for somebody else. There is nothing like definite, overt action to overcome the inertia of grief. This is what we need in a time of crisis. Most of us have someone who needs us. If we haven't, we can find someone. Instead of praying only for the strength we ourselves need to survive this day or this hour, how about praying for some to give away? How about trusting God to fulfill his own promise, my strength is made perfect in weakness? It is here that a great spiritual principle goes into operation. Isaiah 58, verses 10 through 12 says, "If you pour yourself out for the hungry and satisfy the desires of the afflicted, then shall your light rise in the darkness, and your gloom be as the noonday. And the Lord will guide you continually and satisfy your desire in scorched places and make your bones strong. And you shall be like a watered garden, like a spring of water whose waters do not fail. and your ancient ruins shall be rebuilt. You shall raise up the foundations of many generations. You shall be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of streets to dwell in. Whenever a loved one dies, it is not only the person himself who dies. There is a sense in which their loved ones also die, or at least a large part of us dies. Part of Joseph was buried in Machpelah's cave when he placed his beloved father next to Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Leah. Part of us also lies buried when we bury a spouse, a child, or a parent. But as believers, we have reason of hope that leads us through the stages of our grief. In the fall of 1991, a car driven by a drunk driver jumped its lane and smashed headfirst into a minivan driven by Jerry Sitzer. Sitzer and 3 of his children survived, but Sitzer's wife, 4-year-old child, and mother died in the crash. Over the years, Sitzer has offered some profound reflections about loss, grief, and suffering. In his book, A Grace Revealed, Sitzer shares the following story about his son David's responding to this tragic accident. My son David is and always has been quiet and reflective. After the accident, he was the least likely to talk about it. But when he chose to, he usually had something significant to say or ask. I had to be ready to respond to him when he sent cues indicating he was ready to talk. Our best conversations happened in the car. One particular conversation has stayed fresh in my memory. David was 8 at the time. We were driving to a soccer match some distance from our house. Typical for these occasions, David was quiet. The car was full of silence, not a heavy silence, but a liquid silence, as if some question was brewing inside him. Do you think Mom sees us right now? He suddenly asked. I paused to ponder. I don't know, David. I think maybe she does see us. Why do you ask? I don't see how she could, Dad. I thought heaven was full of happiness. How could she bear to see us so sad? I think she does see us, I finally said after a long pause. But she sees the whole story, including how it all turns out, which is beautiful to her. It's going to be a good story, David. Listen. The Christian answer to suffering is Christ's suffering and Christ's resurrection. God knows pain within himself, and he knows the whole story, how it all turns out, which is glorious indeed. 17th century English poet George Herbert has written, Death used to be an executioner, but the gospel has made him just a gardener.